Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So today I want to discuss SSH keys and also hardware keys like the Yubico key here. And usually you hear a Yubico key being discussed in the context of two-factor authentication, but today we're going to talk about using your Yubico hardware key to log in to SSH terminals, and moreover how to do that on a Incus container. So the topic is going to be Incus SSH keys and Yubico. So OpenSSH Server is the premier connectivity tool for remote login over terminals via the SSH protocol. And if you've watched the channel for some time, you notice that OpenSSH is one of the first apps that I typically install on any of our container instances. So OpenSSH Server was first released in 1999 as an alternative to Telnet and also FTP. And that's something that a lot of people are not aware of. So I have covered SFTP, otherwise known as Secure File Transfer Protocol, in a video entitled Managing Files on Self-Hosted Servers, and then I covered SSH in several tutorials, notably one entitled Superpowered SSH, where I discussed SSH Remote X11 displays. And SSH supports enhanced security for logins using both software and hardware keys. So what about key-based logins? Well, SSH supports the use of public and private keys, which allow logins to servers without the use of a password. And software keys can be configured as the only login method and are more secure than passwords because they cannot be as easily compromised. And so beginning with OpenSSH version 8.2, the public key type ED25519-SK supports universal second factor fast identity logon, otherwise known as U2F/FIDO hardware keys as open standards. And the -SK on the end means that we're going to be using a hardware key. And then new YubiKeys, such as the USB or NFC based YubiKeys that have firmware version 5.2.3 or higher, support something called FIDO2, which also supports WebAuthn, or logging on through a web page with your hardware security key, and I've covered that before on the channel. So today I'm going to show how to use both software key pairs and hardware keys to authorize SSH logins on Incus containers. Here we are at a terminal prompt, which is also my desktop, which, by the way, coincidentally, is also an Incus server. So I'm going to start by creating an Incus container named test, and I'm using the bridge profile, which we covered in Incus containers step by step, and that's to provide my Incus container with an address on the main LAN. So after creating the container, the first thing that I want to do is an Incus shell over to the container named test. And as a good practice, you want to do an apt update as soon as you create a container to make certain that all the repositories are currently up to date. And we're going to get a couple of errors when that first starts here, and it says temporary error resolving these domains. And the reason is the apt update could not reach the Ubuntu repositories initially. And the reason behind that is because it had not yet gotten an address on the main LAN. So if we do an IP space A, we now have an address on the main LAN of 172.16.1.204. So we should be able to then do an apt update and it should work correctly. And it says that all packages are up to date. So in order to install OpenSSH Server, I want to do an apt install on OpenSSH-server. And that goes ahead and installs OpenSSH Server and establishes the initial keys. Now that OpenSSH Server is installed, I want to go ahead and add myself a username by doing an add user, Scott. I'll give Scott a password. And then I'm going to go ahead and put Scott into the sudo group with a user mod -a G sudo Scott. Let's also go ahead and install the net-tools program with an apt install net-tools, which will give us ifconfig. The ifconfig program just gives us a really nice way to display our address. So if I do an ifconfig, there's that address again of 172.16.1.204. So now that we have a user account, we can go ahead and log out and do an SSH over to 172.16.1.204. And it's coming up in this case and telling me this address has been used from this machine before. So just like it says, I want to do an SSH-keygen and remove that particular address from the system so that I can go ahead and reuse it because it has a different signature. So I go ahead and do that SSH keygen to remove that address from the list on my local machine. Now I'll be able to do an SSH over to that address, and it asks me, do you want to approve this fingerprint? And the answer is yes. And then we get a password prompt. I type in my password, and because my username is the same on my local machine as it is on the remote container, that is Scott in both cases, I did not have to use a username in order to log in. Now if I exit, I could have just as well done a Scott at that address in the event that the username remotely was not the same as the username locally. So for example, if my username locally had been Frank, I would have had to do an SSH Scott at the address like you see here. But in any event, I can always use this even if my username does match on the remote system. So I type in my password, and once again, I am logged into the container. So that would be the simplest use of OpenSSH to log in, and we used a password in order to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of the container, and this time I'm going to do an SSH-copy-ID over to that address. Now I've done some work in advance to allow this to happen, and we're going to go over that in a minute, but I just want you to see what this actually does. And it said that it had copied some keys over to the remote system. And now I go ahead and type in my password. And this time it returns me back to the prompt as opposed to logging into the remote system. Now that the keys have been added to the remote system, I can simply do an SSH over to that system and I will not be prompted for a password, and it logs me in directly with the use of the keys that have been copied over there. So let's find out how we did this, and we'll do that by exiting back to the main system, and we're going to go ahead and create ourselves another container with the command Incus launch, just like we did before, except we're going to create another container, and this time it will be called test2. Let's go and sign into the test2 container, and we're going to do that with an Incus shell over to test2. The first thing we're going to do is an apt update, and the container is completely up to date. The second thing that we're going to do is an apt install on open SSH-server in order to have the OpenSSH server installed. So let's go ahead and add myself a user account to the test2 container, and I do so with an add user on Scott. I give Scott a password, and then I'll go ahead and I will add Scott into the sudo group over here as well, just in case we need it, with the usermod -a G sudo Scott. Let's go ahead and log out of the test2 container, and just as a reminder, we can do an Incus list, and the test container has an address of 172.16.1.204, and the test2 container has an address of 172.16.1.143, both on the main LAN in virtue of the bridge profile. Rather than using SSH to connect over to the container named test, I'm going to do an Incus shell over to test. And the reason is I don't want to carry my context from my desktop over there in regards to keys. So I'm going to go ahead and do an SU over to Scott. And now we're logged into the Scott account, although not via SSH. So you would think that you would be able to do an SSH-copy-ID over to test2, which is 172.16.1.143, and it'll go ahead and say that it has no identities found. And that's because we have to do one other step first. We actually have to create the key pairs to copy over to the test2 node, and we're going to do that with an SSH-keygen. And the type of key we're going to ask for is an RSA key, and we're going to set its byte size to 4096 characters. And this is just a review because I've done this before on the channel. It's just that we're going to look at this, and then we're going to look at what we're really going to be doing. So it asks for the file name. I just go ahead and hit enter, and the same thing for the passphrase. The passphrase is just an additional password if we wanted to have that. So now I can do my SSH-copy-ID over to 172.16.1.143, and it says that it's copied one key over there, and then it asks for my password over there, and then once it asks for the password, it adds the key to the remote database. So now if I do an SSH over to 172.16.1.143, we're able to log in without a password in virtue of the key pairs. Key pairs are really powerful in terms of security, but if you want to be even more secure, then you can consider using a Yubico key, otherwise known as a hardware key, in order to handle your encryption or connection to the remote node automatically. And the hardware key is good because It's something that you have to physically have in order to be able to log in. For this next set of demos, I want to create 2 new containers that I know have no SSH keys. So the first container, we're going to go ahead and name it Yubico 1, and the second container we'll go ahead and name Yubico-2. Let's go ahead and perform the updates on Yubico 1 with an Incus exec Yubico-1 apt update. And then let's go ahead and do the same thing with Yubico 2 with the apt update. And now we want to install OpenSSH server on both. So let's go ahead and do an Incus exec Yubico 1 apt install OpenSSH server with the -y so that it won't prompt us. I'm going to go ahead and clear my screen here and do the same install of OpenSSH server on Yubico-2. Now let's go ahead and add a Scott user account on Yubico 1 and give Scott a password. And let's go ahead and add the Scott account on Yubico 2 and give it a password. If I do an LS-USB here on my local desktop machine, you can see that my Yubico key has a vendor ID of 1050 and a product ID of 0407. If I want to make this Yubico key accessible to the Yubico 1 Incus container, I'll need to add it as a virtual device. And so I do an Incus config device add to the container Yubico-1, and I'm arbitrarily calling the Yubico key security-key. And then we're using a special designator called Unix-hotplug, and we're saying that it is vendor ID 1050 and product ID 0407, which we got from the ls-usb command. And finally, mode equals 0666 is required in order to be able to access the device from a permissions perspective. And once we hit enter on this command, it says device security-key is added to Yubico 1. Now we want to do an Incus shell over to Yubico-1. And the next step, which is extremely important, is that you'll notice that it says that it uses the device type Unix-hotplug, and that means we need to hotplug the device. So if it's already plugged into your system, which it is because we did the ls-USB on the host, we have to unplug it and then plug it back in. So let's go see if we can see our Yubico key from here. And I'm going to go ahead and SU over to the Scott account on this Yubico 1 container first of all. And then I'm going to do an ls-USB. And of course it says that the ls-USB command is not found. So what we want to do is a sudo apt install on USB utils, and that will install the USB utilities. And of course it says that Scott is not in the sudoers group, so we have to exit out of here and do a user mod -a capital G sudo Scott, and then I can SU back over to Scott, and then I can install USB utils, provide my password, and this time it works. So now at this point, I could do an LSUSB and see my USB devices. Now this would have worked even though we don't have access to all of these devices. You can still list them, and we haven't really determined yet that we have access to this Yubico. It's just listed as something connected to this host. So remember that our access is virtual at this point in time, and so we really don't have direct access to the device. Let's go ahead and add the Yubico repository to this particular container, and it's now saying that the add apt repository command is not found. And that's because Incus containers start out pretty lean, and so we'll need to do a sudo apt install software-properties-common. Now that software properties common is installed, we can now do the sudo apt add repository for the Yubico repository, and I hit enter and it goes ahead and adds that repository. And now we'll need to do an apt update. Actually, that has to be a sudo apt update because I'm on my user account. And now it says that the signature for that key is invalid, so that's kind of interesting. Let's see whether or not it's able to install the Yubico manager, see whether that will actually work. And let's go ahead and do a sudo apt install on Yubico-manager. Now that the Yubico manager is installed, we can issue ykman commands. And so, for example, I do a ykman FIDO credentials list, and if the virtual device is working correctly, it should be able to go all the way over there. And of course, one of the first things it asks me for is my PIN code on my Yubico, which I established when I installed some of my first applications using the Yubico. So I enter that, and it comes back and lists some of the credentials that I have installed on that key. So if I want to delete a credential, as an example, I could use the ykman FIDO credentials delete command, and so I could go ahead and enter that. And then suppose I wanted to get rid of this key called my key, I could just go ahead and copy that key and paste it in here, and it would go ahead and ask for my PIN code again, and then it would ask, do you really want to delete the key called my key? And yes, I do. I just created it for the purposes of this video. And now if I go back and list my credentials and type in the PIN code again, we get a list of credentials. So as an example here, we are accessing a Yubico key from a Incus container. Just like when we created RSA keys for the key pair authorization, we can also create key pairs for the Yubico device, and we do that with the command ssh-keygen, where the type is ed25519-sk, and the -sk means that we're talking to that hardware device. So now it asks me for my PIN code on the Yubico, and when I hit enter, it is flashing my Yubico right now. Keep in mind we're inside of a container called Yubico 1, but my host happens to be my desktop Incus server, and that desktop Incus server has the Yubico key plugged in. So now I touch the key, it stops flashing, and it comes up and says enter the file in which you want to install it. that file is just fine. So I hit enter, and then I hit enter again and enter again, since I do not feel as though I need the extra security of also having a passcode. So let's go ahead and log into my Yubico 2 Incus container, and that has the address of 203. So I'll do an SSH of 172.16.1.203. It asks me, are you sure you want a fingerprint for that? Yes, we do. It asks for the password, and I go ahead and log in. So that's password login for the Yubico 2 container. So I'm going to exit back here to Yubico 1, and now I'll do an SSH-copy-ID, and it's going to copy the IDs we just created for the Yubico device over to the Yubico 2 system. And see, it says that it has one key remaining to be copied. I go ahead and type in my password, and we're back at Yubico 1. So now on Yubico 1, if I do an SSH over to 172.16.1.203 and hit enter, it says confirm user presence for ED25519-SK, which of course is the name of the key. And if I look over, I can see that my Yubico key is flashing on my host machine. I touch it, and it goes ahead and logs in. Just as a reminder, I have created myself another terminal back on my host machine. And if I now try to SSH over to 172.16.1.203, which is the address of Yubico 2, I'm still able to log on with my password. So as a big giant point of caution and a huge red flag here that I can't emphasize enough, you might want to authorize more than one YubiKey into your servers if you're going to allow for Yubico login only. And that's because if you lose your YubiKey, you have no way to get back into that server. So now we're going to go ahead and disable the ability to use a password, thus forcing all users to have the Yubico key. And we do that by doing a sudo nano on /etc/ssh/sshd, meaning SSH daemon configuration file. It asks me for my password, and it goes into that file, but as it says here, that Scott is not in the sudoers file. So I go ahead and exit out of this system, and I go back over here where I do have control, and I go ahead and exit out of the YubiKey 2 system, and I go ahead and exit out of there and exit out of root. And now I'm going to go ahead and Incus shell over to Yubico 2, and I'm going to do a user mod -a capital G sudo Scott. And now I'll go ahead and SU over to the Scott account again, just to put me back over on Yubico 2. And now I go ahead and do my sudo nano on the sshd config file, type in my password, and now I am in the sudo file. Unfortunately, nano doesn't exist because, again, these containers are really lean, so we're going to have to do a sudo apt install on nano. I have subscribers tell me all the time how I need to include some of the common errors in my demonstrations. And so you've seen here that we had to add quite a few dependencies in order to be able to do what we need to do. Now we should be able to edit the SSHD config file since we have both sudo privilege and the nano editor, and we have gotten in there. So what we want to look for is we want to look for do a control W to do a search, and we want to look for something called challenge. And we have a challenge response area here, but that's not really what we wanted. We want to go ahead and search for the next one. So I do another control W and hit enter, and it didn't find challenge. So we're going to go ahead and add our own keys in here. I kind of figured they would be in here, but that's okay. The keys we want to add are 3 in particular, and we want to add challenge response authentication is no, and password authentication is no, and use PAM is equal to no. And so now I do a control X, and I'm going to go ahead and write the file out. And now that I've written the file out, we want to restart the SSH daemon. And of course here I'm not SSH'd into it, which is a good thing, otherwise that would disconnect me. And it said that it can't start the SSH daemon. Let's try SSH, and that seemed to have worked correctly. So now I should be able to exit out of here and exit out. And then from here, if I try to do, can't remember the address, if I do an Incus list, and we have Yubico 2, if I do an SSH over to 172.16.1.203, which is Yubico 2, it'll say that permission is denied because my desktop machine does not have permission to get over there. But if I go over to 143, which is Yubico, no, not 143, 210, which is Yubico 1, it gives me a SSH keygen failure because I guess I haven't signed on from it directly. So we'll go ahead and remove that key, and now we'll try to go into Yubico 1. And I type in my password, and I'm logged into Yubico 1. At this point, if I go over to 203, which is Yubico 2, and I hit enter, it will prompt me for my Yubico key, and I'm able to touch it and log in. And now the only way to log in is with the Yubico key. So if I was to exit out of here and pull the Yubico key out of my machine and then do the SSH again, it'll say permission is denied because it says confirming presence, but it couldn't actually find the key, and so it won't let me log in. If I insert the key back into my host desktop machine, now Yubico 1 can SSH over there because it says confirm user presence, and it sits and waits until I touch the flashing key, and once I touch it, it logs me in again. So SSH key pairs are really secure, but if somehow a user finds their way into the machine that has all of your SSH key pairs, they can log into all of the other machines that you have key pairs established for. However, if you set up a Yubico key to do your SSH authentication, they have to physically have the Yubico key in order to be able to log into your servers. Even though the key pair may be present, it requires the hardware device. So in summary, SSH software key pairs and U2F FIDO hardware authentication are excellent ways to secure your home lab server instances and your container instances as well. So if you have Incus containers that you want to secure, consider using a hardware key like a Yubico device. And in today's tutorial, we saw how to configure SSH key pairs as the primary login method for your servers and containers. And we also saw that a U2F FIDO key, such as the Yubico hardware key, can greatly increase SSH security. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.